Hi, my name is Jeffrey Stone. I'm a professor of law at the University of Chicago, and it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to have this conversation with John D'Amelio. I've long admired John's work. I've drawn upon his work in the past, and I had the opportunity to read his latest book that we're here to discuss today, In a New Century, Essays on Queer History, Politics, and Community Life. And it's a terrific read with lots of interesting essays, and I highly recommend it. John is a professor of gender and women's studies and history at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he's a pioneer in the developing field of gay and lesbian studies and the award-winning author and editor of more than half a dozen books. He's been honored by Yale University, received Guggenheim Foundation and National Endowment of the Humanities Fellowships. He's been a fellow at the Center of Advanced Studies at Stanford, and his book Lost Prophet was named a National Book Award finalist. So John, this is a collection of essays rather than a single historical study. So can you give us some sense of the range and scope of what these essays cover?
Sure. I think what I try more than anything else to do in these essays is to connect history to LGBT issues in the present moment, to take advantage of the fact that there's been more than 50 years now of struggling for equality, struggling for change around sexual identity, and to use the insights of history to give us a better sense of what's going on now and what alternatives there might be and things like that. So I move back and forth between past and present.
So the title of the book, In a New Century, evokes the sense of change, of something new. In what ways would you say that the 21st century has represented a break with the past?
A number of different ways. One is, and I have to say I've noticed this tremendously in terms of my students' changing relationship to these issues over the years. One is that in the 21st century, there's been an escalation, you could say, in the level of visibility of gay and lesbian, increasingly also transgender issues in popular culture. I like to describe the period that we're in now as the post-Ellen generation, that Ellen's coming out in 1997 sort of marked a shift that occurred, so we now have unimaginable series from that perspective back then, like Glee and Modern Family and RuPaul's Drag Race and things like that. So visibility. A second thing is just the way that, we'll use marriage as the example, but there hasn't been a time before where some kind of gay and lesbian issue has been constantly in the public eye. And not only in the public eye, but embraced by large segments of the public. And I would say that a sort of a third example of sort of change in the 21st century is that it's become more and more clear the way in which gender identity, transgender, is separating itself out from sexual identity, gay and lesbian, as a stance or a relationship to self and society.
What do you think triggered the change? I mean, we went through a very long time in which these issues were submerged and simply not discussed or addressed. Mm-hmm. I tell my students that in the first almost 20 years that I was a law professor, I had only one student who was openly gay. Mm-hmm. And now, I mean, there's so many, I don't even know who's gay and who's not gay. It's not even all that interesting anymore. Yeah. So what made this happen?
Well, one aspect of it is, and really do not underestimate the power of individuals and individuals working together, is we've had 50 years of activism now. And that activism has, there have been ebbs and flows to it. But people have kept coming out of the closet. They have kept banding together to make change. They have pushed against the limits of what's possible. A second thing that has made a huge difference, we always talk about the Stonewall Rebellion, and gay pride marches commemorate the Stonewall Rebellion, and that's the beginning of gay liberation. But really, it's the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and early 90s that made a much more dramatic difference in terms of bringing huge numbers of people out of the closet and people organizing for change. So Those are two things. The one other thing I would say, though, and this is going to sound funny in the context of all the movement around marriage, but over the last 50 years, as LGBT people have been organizing, the lives of heterosexuals have changed. And they've changed in ways that have made them more like what we imagine gay life to be like, which is that you don't spend your whole life from the age of 18 or 19 married in a household with the children that you're raising. But you meet somebody, you hang out for a while. Anyway, heterosexual life and gay life isn't as different as it used to be.
Interesting. You seem to have a great faith in the power of history as a force for making change. But for a lot of people, history is nothing more than names and dates that they memorize in high school. Talk about this. Why are you so committed to history?
Well, I mean, at the most personal level, I grew up in an Italian Catholic family who, we learned early on that God always was, always will be, always remains the same, and so does everything else. Nothing ever will change. The way it is now is the way it's always going to be. You do what you're told. Your mother and father and grandparents knows best. History was so personally liberating for me because history is a story of change. It's like you read about the past and you realize, oh, it wasn't the way it is now. But I think for LGBT people, I mean, this is changing for some of us now because of changing family configurations. But unlike an Italian heritage person who grew up in a family of Italians and who taught me about my culture and my heritage, when you're gay or lesbian, you don't usually grow up in that context. And so as you begin to figure this out about yourself, it represents this sense of, oh, I'm not connected to anyone I've ever known, or I have no stories that have been passed down to me. And so discovering LGBT history is like finding a place for yourself in the world. And in addition to that, there have been campaigns where history has made a difference. The work that Alan Berreby did about gays and lesbians during World War II had a tremendous impact during the gays in the military debate in the 90s, for instance. So I'm a fan of history. It's true.
I was surprised to see that for someone who's devoted so much of his time and his life to the LGBT cause, you express a certain skepticism about identity movements and the change they can bring about.
Right, I've spent a good bit of my life in an identity movement, working on identity-based issues. But one of the perspectives that history provides, it's like 50 years now of activism on this issue, is that we have enough time to notice that, and this is the way I put it in a couple of the essays, the benefits of identity-based movements are not equally distributed. Just to give kind of examples of what I mean, Barack Obama can be president of the United States, and on the south side of Chicago, the police are rounding up young black gay men, and they're going to spend a lot of their lives in prison. Hillary Clinton can, be a prospective candidate for president and Secretary of State, and lots of young women are facing teenage pregnancies and will have a hard time in life. I can be a tenured professor of history and gender studies with a really secure job, and there are all of these young queer folks who are getting bullied and beat up and thrown out of their homes. So identity movements have done wonderful things, but as time goes on, you realize that some people in a group benefit from that identity movement more than others in the group. And so it's not enough just to be LGBT focused.
So you just need more movements.
Well, you need more movements, but you need more redefining of issues. Like, for instance, this is a really good example of what I mean. Okay, so there's a lot of organizing going on right now around school-based issues. There's an Illinois State